I'd like to welcome you to the next devotional that we're doing today. We want to kind of segue into the last one. We covered Psalms 83 and went into great detail. And so I want to kind of segue out of that. We talked about in the last devotional about what's going on in the valley. When we walk through this valley in our journey to know God, what's actually going on in this valley that is the valley of Becca, the valley of weeping and distress. And we talked about the fact that one of the things that's going on is that we noticed in Psalms 83, the psalmist says, "Oh God, don't be quiet, don't be still, because the enemy is in an uproar, making shrewd plans against your treasured ones." And what we've noticed is this, is that as we try to walk with God and get to know God, there's an opposing force coming against us. And you engage the enemy, the powers of darkness is what I call, who hate God, who hate God's children, and who are opposing us, trying to block us, trying to trip us up, trying to keep us from getting to Zion to know God. They're putting together shrewd plans. And in that passage in Psalms 83, it says, deal with them as you dealt with Midian. We looked in Judges, and there's the steps of victory over Midian. There is a verse that I did not cover in the last devotional that I want to start out with because it segues into what I want to talk about today. It's found in Judges chapter 7, verse 25a, just the first part. It says, they captured the two leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. Stop right there. Now, Oreb and Zeb were the two leaders of Midian. And Gideon and his men chased them down and they killed them. They destroyed them. Why was it so important to get a hold of Oreb and Zeb? Because their names literally meant raven and wolf. And so here's a type and shadow of what they were dealing with when they were fighting Midian. They were fighting Oreb and Zeb, raven and a wolf. What does a raven and a wolf have in common? They both feed on flesh. And I'm telling you, in this battle against the unseen enemy, the powers of darkness, one of the tactics that the enemy will use is they will try to entice the flesh. Now, we have to deal with the flesh if we're going to have victory. And that's the segue into today's devotional. But someone asks me all the time, why is it that you preach so much out of the Old Testament? Why don't you preach in the New Testament? Well, I'm going to today. The devotional today is in the New Testament. Now, I told you that they chased Oreb and Zeb, the raven and the wolf. They both have in common they feed on flesh. Well, I want you to listen to me, because what I'm about to say is very important. We looked at Psalms 83 last week, and we said that the psalmist says, don't be still, don't be quiet, God, because the enemy is in an uproar, putting together shrewd plans that they might destroy the people of God so that their life is insignificant. Wow. Now, in the Old Testament, in Psalms 83, he says the enemy's putting together a plan. But if you'll turn to James chapter 1, and don't turn, you'll see the verses on the screen. In James chapter 1, God reveals the shrewd plan. God shows us what the enemy's plan is, how it works, how they trip us up, how they mislead us, how they defeat us. Listen, in James chapter 1, I want to break this little passage down, starting in verse 13. In James chapter 1, let's walk just through this slowly. James chapter 1, verse 13. Listen, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Listen, when you go into these dark valleys and you feel this real pressure to do wrong, that is not coming from God. You say, why did God put me here? Why did God lead me here? Listen, these valleys we walk through are two things. They're a test of our faith, and temptation. Through these valleys, two things are happening. God is testing us, and the enemy is trying to tempt us. And so when you find yourself being enticed to do wrong, listen what he says. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. You need to understand that God himself never tempts you to do wrong, to respond wrong. Will he test your heart? Absolutely. Will he put you in a difficult place? Absolutely. To see what's in your heart, to test your faith. But to try to get you to do wrong, God would never, ever put you in a place where he is trying to get you to do wrong. So number one, if you're in a place where there's temptation taking place and you feel the pressure of temptation, it's not coming from God. Number one. Number two, look at verse 14. But on the contrary, each one is tempted. Let's stop right there. Okay, we are being tempted. Okay? So if God's not tempting us and we're being tempted, who's doing the temptation? It is exactly what I was trying to communicate in Psalms 83. Those who hate God and those who hate God's treasured ones, us. In other words, let me just be plain. It's the devil and all of the kingdom of darkness that works with him. They are putting together shrewd plans against us. They are trying to tempt us to do wrong. But each one is tempted. So he and the powers of darkness are tempting us, putting pressure on us, okay, to do wrong. Then look what God says. He exposes their plan. Verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust or fleshly desires. Listen, what the enemy is doing to try to cause us to fall or to mislead us is to try to carry us away. Now, what do you mean? We're walking with God in a safe place. Our heart's going after God. So the enemy in these valleys, they try to create a circumstance by which they entice the flesh. Let me just put it this way. Have you ever noticed the things that don't bother you never happen, but the things that bother you happen all the time? He's creating a circumstance around you in the valleys, in these times of struggle, to try to draw your fleshly desires, to get angry, to be lustful, to be prideful, to be hateful, to be unmerciful, to try to get us these fleshly desires. But each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust, his own fleshly desires. I was fishing on a lake one time with my boys, and we could never get the fish to bite. So one day we were in that little town on vacation. I went into a little bait shop and I was looking through different bait, and one of the locals there found out that we were on vacation and fishing in what lake, and he says, "Oh, listen, if you're fishing that lake, this is the kind of bait you need to use, because those fish only hit this one." And so we bought a bunch of them, went back to fishing, and where we had fished for a day and didn't catch anything, we began to catch fish like crazy, because that little lure was what these fish were enticed by. That's what enticed them. Now listen, the devil's got a tackle box. He opens it up, and he finds out what it is that gets your goat. Someone says, that just gets my goat. And someone else said, well, quit telling the devil where you got him tied up. Listen, he will find something that bugs your flesh, and he'll continuously use that lure to entice you away from the safe highway, the highway of holiness, that path going towards God, to try to mislead you, distract you, and entice you away by getting these desires stirred up. Watch this. But each man is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own fleshly desires. Verse 15. Look what happens next. Then, when the enemy is able to set the hook in you, so to speak, you hit, he's enticing you, and you strike, and you become angry, and you become lustful, and you become unmerciful or unkind or prideful and arrogant, and you begin to strike at that lure, and the devil sets the hook in you, then all of a sudden, look what happens. Then when lust is conceived, they set the hook. It gives birth to sin. All of a sudden, you're walking in the power of the flesh now. You're operating in the power of the flesh now. And all the works of the flesh now are beginning to be manifest. You're angry. You're fearful. You're hateful. You're unforgiving. You're bitter. You're lustful. You're prideful. All the works of the flesh begin to manifest in you. It gives birth to sin. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. You're manifesting the flesh. You're walking in the flesh. And you're responding to people in the flesh. Notice this. And when sin is accomplished, when the flesh works its work and completes its task, it brings forth death and destruction. I'm telling you, when a Christian gets off the path of the highway of holiness, when he is lured away and enticed away by the devil and the powers of darkness, and they give into that temptation, that fleshly desire. Listen, I'm telling you, when we give in, we sin. And when we sin, it begins to work in us. And when it finishes its work, it ends in destruction and death. And James says this in verse 16, do not be deceived, or do not be led astray. Do not be led astray, my beloved brethren. Don't let the enemy entice you to take your eyes off the Lord. Don't let the enemy entice your flesh, stir up your flesh to get angry and respond in pride and bitterness and lust and all the works of the flesh. Listen, in James chapter 1, verses 3 through 16, God exposes that shrewd plan of the enemy. This is how he works. The enemy is the one doing the tempting, not God. The enemy is trying to carry you away by stirring up your own lust, enticing you by your own fleshly desires. And when you give in and he sets the hook, it will give birth to sin and disobedience in your life. And when sin and disobedience works its work in you, it ends in disaster. It ends in defeat. It ends in destruction. And all of a sudden now your walk with God is neutralized and you become insignificant to the kingdom of God because you're over here walking in the power of the flesh. And everything you're doing and building for God's kingdom is wood, hay, and stubble. It's not gold, silver, precious stone, because it's not a walk in the Spirit. It is a walk in the power of the flesh, manifesting the fruits and works of the flesh, which is sin. Listen, beloved brothers and sisters, do not be misled. Don't be enticed, and don't take the bait. Keep your eyes on the Lord Jesus Christ. That's why he said, hey, do to my enemies like you did with Midian. Help us to be fearless. Help us to be cautious, careful, sober. Help us, Lord, to break the picture. That's the flesh. To put aside the fleshly response and to lift up the torch of Jesus. Listen, the reason why the outer man, that old flesh, has got to be crucified and put aside is because greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world. The God of this world is trying to trip us up. But if we'll put aside the flesh, crucify the flesh, consider ourselves dead to ourselves, and that's breaking the outer pot, and lift up Jesus. Listen, again, greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world. And the only way you become victorious in the valley and overcome the temptation is to let Jesus face it. He faced it in the wilderness. And we'll talk about that later. The devil came to Jesus and he tempted him. Jesus overcame every temptation of the devil in the wilderness. And guess what? That same Jesus lives in you. And if you'll let Him, He'll help you be victorious in the valley when temptation comes your way. God bless you. I hope this encourages you in your walk. Let God speak to you. I look forward to our next devotional.